Greetings, and welcome to Tactical Inc., your portal to the captivating realm of all things Lorcana. I'm Bradley.
And I'm Alex. In today's video, we're going to talk about the basics of deck building and how we've come to build our own personal decks.
And we broke this down into 7 steps. So looking at our first step, you must know the basic rules required for a deck.
Your deck includes at least 60 cards. This means you can have more than 60, but it's not necessarily recommended because it makes your deck less consistent.
Your deck can contain up to 4 copies of each card. For example, you can run 4 copies of Hades, King of Olympus. And just because you have 4 copies of Hades, King of Olympus, doesn't mean you can't run another card named Hades. You can also run 4 copies of Hades, Infernal Schemer.
Your deck can only contain up to 2 ink colors. There's 6 ink colors in total in Lorcana, all unique in their own kind of way, which brings us into step 2, ink color identity and their goals.
And each color of ink has their own identity. So we've gone through the 6 colors of ink, and we've come up with a little summary of each, as well with common goals of that specific color. So the first color we'll look at is amber.
With amber, we see it's an ink that relies on characters working together. Common goals you'll see in amber include multi-character, just swarming the board with characters to gain lore through some of these little characters like Lilo making a wish. This also includes cards such as Stitch Rockstar, who can be shifted in as early as turn 4 to start drawing you cards based on how many characters you've got on the board.
There's also bodyguard, protecting your characters to gain lore, making your opponents only attack your bodyguard characters, such as Maximus, Palace Horse.
Then there's singing, using powerful songs early to gain advantage using cards like Cinderella Ballroom Sensation and Ariel Spectacular Singer, who also fishes you for more songs.
There's also healing, healing your characters to gain advantages, such as Rapunzel, gifted with healing, that removes damage, and for each damage removed, she draws you a card. Moving on to the next color, we have Amethyst. And Amethyst relies on abilities of cards to push your goal. And these abilities have a wide range of different effects, and we see a few common goals from them.
Amethyst uses card draw a lot, cycling through your deck to find key pieces and finding answers for victory. Friends on the Other Side is probably one of the best card advantage cards currently in the game, which draws you 2 cards and can be sung.
They also use bounds, returning characters to your hand to play them again, gaining effects and playing bigger characters.
And then Amethyst has control, using effects that stall your opponent's game plan while progressing yours. Elsa's Spirit of Winter is a great example of this, which is a card to lock down opponents and exerting characters as she's played, going for the win in the late game.
And if you want some control and drawing cards at the same time, then you have characters such as Ursula, Power Hungry, that lowers opponents' lore, slowing them down and drawing a card for each opponent.
Moving on to the third color we have, which is Emerald. Emerald is a color that gives opponents hard choices, most of the time either allowing you to advance your goal to win or slowing down the opponent's pace to win.
And some goals of Emerald include Enticers, cards that give your opponents a choice of either letting you move closer to your goal or taking a toll to slow you down. An example of this is Cusco, Temperamental Emperor. He has 3 lore, which is great for you, reaching victory sooner. He has Ward, so opponents can't target it with cards like Dragonfire or Hades Infernal Schemer. So the only way to remove it is by challenging it.
You see similar cards to this in Emerald like Bell Hidden Archer, Cheshire Cat Not All There, and Flynn Rider Charming Rogue, all with their own unique abilities to progress your game plan.
Next, we have Discard. Cards that discard your opponent's hand, giving you card advantage over them. Hypnotize, Flynn Rider Charming Rogue, and Lucifer Cunning Cat are all great examples of these. Then you can have cards that support it, such as Prince John, greediest of all, that draws you cards for each card discarded.
There's also damaged character effects, which capitalize on the damage that you've already done to your opponent's characters, allowing you to remove things with damage on them like Ring the Bell or with Cheshire Cat from the Shadows. Pairs up very well with steel cards that like to deal damage to characters.
Next, we have action effects, returning actions to reuse them over and over with Lady Tremaine, Wicked Stepmother, or playing actions for free with Genie, Powers Unleashed.
You see this being useful as well in boosting your characters like Pete Bad Guy. We also have a bounce effect in Emerald, but it's a little different than Amethyst. Instead of returning stuff to your hand, you return your opponent's stuff to their hand. Examples are Cruella de Vil, Miserable as Usual, Genie on the Job, and Mother Knows Best.
And another goal is evasive, having characters that can't be challenged unless the opponent has evasive, meaning you can gain a lot of lore before they can get removed. Ray, easygoing Firefly, Tinkerbell, most helpful, and Flynn Rider, his own biggest fan, are all examples of this.
Next color up is Ruby. Ruby's a color about combat and removing threats from your opponent's field. Some of Ruby's goals include removal, using cards such as Maleficent Dragon, Dragonfire to banish a character. Or the baddest removal currently in the game, which is Be Prepared to banish all characters. Just such a huge threat that you've always got to be worried about when playing against Ruby.
Then there's challenging characters, using cards like Aladdin, Heroic Outlaw, Shere Khan, Menacing Predator, and Queen of Hearts, Sense and Weakness, are seeking for your characters to challenge your opponents. Maui, Hero to All, is such a good card that has to challenge because of Reckless, and it can challenge the first turn because of Rush. And with his stats, he is able to sometimes pick off 2 or 3 characters before he goes down.
We also see Self-Infliction coming into Rise of the Floodborn. These are cards that deal damage to your own characters to give you advantages, like with Donald Duck Not Again, who gains more lore based on the amount of damage put on him, or Mother Gothel Wicked and Withered, who comes into play damaged and then can be used with healing effects to gain you some advantages. Self-Infliction cards pair nicely with Dinner Bell, a card that lets you draw lots of cards for a character that has damage on them.
Then we see Evasive again, but this time, instead of Emerald, it's also in Ruby. Cards include Minnie Mouse Surfer, Mickey Mouse, Brave Tailor, and Pongo Old Rascal. Moving on to the next color, we have Sapphire. Sapphire is a color that focuses on strategies and items to outsmart opponents.
One of these goals includes Ink Ramp. Ink Ramp is where you play multiple cards into your ink per turn, getting you to outpace your opponent. Mickey Mouse Detective, Fishbone Quill, One Jump Ahead are all cards that are example of ramping up your ink, meaning you'll have more ink than your opponent to play your bigger cards or play more cards before your opponent has a chance to react.
Then we see items as a goal. While all colors have items, Sapphire uses your items to give you advantage, such as Hiram Flavisher, drawing you cards by removing your items, Ariel Who's It Collector, that can quest multiple times a turn the more items you play, and Noi, Orphan Thief, that gains resist and ward while you control an item, giving you an early annoying character that's hard to remove and gains you lore.
Just like Amber, Sapphire also has healing as a goal. Cards like Jasmine, Heir of Agrabah can help heal your characters very effectively, and then Grandpappy, Oldest and Wisest, gains you lots of lore for healing your characters up.
It also has removal strategies, outsmarting opponents by using cards such as Hades, Infernal Schemer, or Let It Go, both sending a character from the battlefield to their owner's ink face down. Those effects get around characters that need to be banished to gain their effects, such as Mufasa Betrayed Leader, or the Musketeers item, Musketeer Tabard, that lets you draw when your Musketeers are banished.
The last color to look at is Steel. Steel is all about damage, stats, and defense. So let's talk about damage. Steel's dealing damage early, with cards like Fire the Cannons or Let the Storm Rage On, helping to control the board early on. It can even deal damage in the late game with cards like Tinkerbell Giant Fairy, possibly removing multiple characters at one time.
Then we see the goal of defenses. Steel has a lot of characters with great stats such as Goofy, Night for a Day, and Maui Demigod. They also include Beast Selfless Protector that has 8 willpower and takes all your character's damage for you.
Speaking of defenses, just like Amber, Steel has the goal using Bodyguard. With cards like Mickey Mouse Musketeer that have a high willpower, it has Bodyguard to protect your characters, and the Prince Never Gives Up that has Bodyguard and Resist, making him harder to take down.
And speaking of Resist, Steel is one of the best options to center around Resist. Cards like Cinderella Stouthearted and Kronk, Junior Chipmunk have Resist, making them hard to remove from the field from challenges and damaging effects.
Hope this short overview of the colors has made it a little more helpful for you to get an idea of what you're wanting to do when deciding what kind of deck you want to build. Now that we know our colors, we need to choose the goal for the deck.
And the ultimate goal will be the same for every deck: win the game. And most decks will be doing that by gaining lore. So you need a goal of how your deck is going to run and win the game before your opponent can.
Knowing some of these goals we mentioned will help pick your colors of ink you want to run. For example, say I want to run an evasive deck. Looking at the colors I see, Emerald and Ruby both have evasive characters, so I might choose both of those colors for the deck.
Or you could choose Ruby for evasive and look at some weaknesses. For examples, it has big hitters like Mickey Mouse Brave Taylor, but you have to wait until turn 8 to play it. So as your second color, you could use Amber or Sapphire to ramp up and get him out quicker to hopefully win the game.
So a lot of the time I'll start with seeing a card or two that sticks out to me and see if it's something that people haven't thought of before. An example that I saw when Rise of the Floodborn came out was cards like Relentless Beast, who is especially effective when damaging your opponents, paired with something like Ring the Bell that banishes your opponent's damaged characters. Of course, that would go along with Steel, so naturally I picked to build a Emerald Steel deck archetype. Anyway, once you've chosen a goal for your deck, then you can start adding cards into it. You can use resources such as the website Lorcana or Lorcana's official app. Both of these have a list of all the cards, and they're super helpful tools for deck building and when searching for keywords or certain goals that you're looking for.
And you want to make sure your deck is consistent. One thing that is helpful in building consistent decks is to look at a few things while adding your cards. Number 1, how will this card help me early game? Number 2, how will this card help me middle game? Number 3, how will this card help me late game? Number 4, how will this card help me when I'm ahead? And number 5, will this card help me when I'm behind?
Now, each of your cards might not fit all 5 of these categories, but it's important to have cards in your deck that can cover a lot of those areas. Let's look at a popular control card as an example, Elsa, Spirit of Women. How can she help you in the early game? Well, she really can't. She isn't inkable, so you can't ink her. She's most likely going to be a mulligan choice, or she's going to sit in your hand for a while. How will she help you in the mid game? If you run other low ink Elsas, you may be able to shift her out early, but other than that, she's not going to do much. Then how does she help in the late game? This is where she shines. She'll shut down your opponent's threats and also gain you a lot of lore to clinch the game up. Her effect also helps when you're ahead or behind. So Elsa fits 3 of these 5 categories. These sort of factors can really help you decide what goes into your deck and make it run more consistently.
And continuing with consistency, as you add cards to your deck, one thing your deck needs to be consistent is the support cards, which is step 3. And we are really looking at 3 things here: removal, card draw, and gaining lore.
First step's removal. You want to have some type of removal in your deck to assure that you can remove opponent's threats. Good options for each color are Maui, Hero to All in Ruby, Yzma, Scary Beyond All Reason in Amethyst, Smash for Steel, Last Stand in Amber, Hades Infernal Schemer as a Sapphire choice, and Ring the Bell as an Emerald choice. Now you might choose to opt out of having removal for a deck that's like hyper aggro, such as Amber Amethyst, that wants to simply forget whatever your opponent's doing and get to 20 lore as fast as possible. This is all just going to depend on what your deck's end goal is, but in general, having removal is something that most decks are going to want.
Next is card draw. Card draw helps you get to your game winners quicker, while giving you more options in your hand. Good options for each color are Friends on the Other Side for Amethyst, Rapunzel, gifted with healing for Amber, Donald Duck, Perfect Gentleman for Emerald, Dinner Bell for Ruby, A Whole New World for Steel, and Popsicle for Sapphire.
Lastly, number 3 is gaining lore. Gaining lore is the way that you win the game. If you don't have viable options to gain lore, then winning might be very difficult. So be sure to make sure that you have plenty of cards that can win the game once all of your resources are on the board, because you may have a great game plan, but be stuck with a lot of lore questing characters that just aren't going to make the cut.
The fourth step is to know the tempo of your deck. Tempo of decks usually fall into one of three categories: aggro, mid-range, and control. Aggro is a deck that wants to use lower level characters to gain lore quickly and finish the game. Using characters like Lilo, Making a Wish, Maleficent, Biding Her Time, and Pinocchio, Star Attraction are good examples of this, gaining a lot of lore before your opponent can even get started.
Mid-range decks want to work well in all situations. They like to be effective in the early and the late game. They play cards on curve every turn, and these cards are effective in bringing your victory. And by playing cards on curve, I mean on turn 1 they play a 1 ink card, turn 2 they play a 2 ink card, turn 3 a 3 ink card, and so on. We'll get more into ink curve on our next step.
Then we get control. Control is a deck that will stall your opponent's goals early game and then take full control late game to take the win. Using cards like Be Prepared to wipe an opponent's full board and then play heavy hitters while they have nothing can just outright win you games. Cards like Pinocchio, Talkative Puppet can shut down early characters. In Lady Tremaine, Overbearing Matriarch. In Aladdin, Street Rat can slow down your opponent's lure so you can catch up.
As mentioned before, we're going to get into step 5 now, which is the ink curve. The tempo of your deck will be visible through the ink curve. Ink curve is a chart that shows how many cards you run of each ink cost in your deck.
And every deck's ink curve may look a little different, but will look completely different depending on the three tempos we've talked about: aggro, mid-range, and control.
Aggro decks will peak very early in the curve and then drop off, so you might only really need 3 or 4 to 5 ink in your inkwell to assure your victory. Mid-range decks will start and end about the same time, with somewhere in the middle being about the top of your curve. And control will most of the time dip in the middle, with the higher cost being the top parts of the curve.
Now this isn't true for all aggro, mid-range, and control decks. It's just what seems to happen with most of the time with those decks. But looking at an ink curve can tell you where your focus is on your deck, and maybe even where your weaknesses are, allowing you to relook at your deck and figure out the most cost-efficient cards to play at each ink cost.
So step 6 is looking at your uninkable cards and how much to limit them. This is another thing you have to think about. Uninkable cards cannot be placed into your inkwell from your hand, so that means if all the cards in your deck are uninkable, you can't ever play anything. It's good to find the right balance of how many inkable and how many uninkable cards you should run.
And most people would say 10 to 12 uninkable cards is a good number to have in a deck. However, this can change depending on the tempo of your deck. If you run an aggro or a lot of card draw, you could probably safely move that number up to around 15 or so, or even higher. It just takes time to find the right balance of inkable and uninkable cards in your deck.
That's the thing, these decks just take time, which leads into the final step to test your deck. Step 7, testing. Test your deck to find the right balance and see how well it works. If you have your deck, play with friends, find people at your local gaming store and play them. If you can't find anybody, you can download Pixelborn online and play for free. Or you can play online at the website untap.im. No matter how you do it, test it out.
Don't just try it one time either. Even the best of decks will lose if they have bad luck or bad matchups. Keep testing it, see what works, what doesn't, see how consistent it is. Find your weaknesses and expand on your strengths. After testing a deck a good 10 times or so, you should be able to have a good sample size of what your deck needs to improve on. Well, that's all for today. What steps did you follow to build a deck? Do you agree with our steps? Tell us in the comments below.
Be sure to follow us on social media to keep up to date on the latest Tactical Ink news.
And also be sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you can tune in every Friday for a new episode of Tactical Ink. See you next week.